Imagine climbing toward a winter sky, certain you know where danger ends, and then realizing in a single instant that the sky has no safe edge at all. That is what happened over central Germany in early 1944, when Luftwaffe pilots suddenly saw American P-51 Mustangs in a place every calculation had said they could never reach. In this video, we step into that cockpit, explain the engineering that made the impossible routine, and follow the choices that turned German confidence into shock. If you enjoy this kind of detailed history and want more stories like it, remember to subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next episodes. On March 6, 1944, about 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Major Hans Kogler led his fighters through thin blue air, his oxygen mask frozen to his face. Below and ahead, the bomber stream of the 8th Air Force pushed toward the heart of the Reich. Ground controllers had promised him the ideal opportunity. At this altitude, this deep inside Germany, the heavy bombers should be unescorted. Single-engine Allied fighters everyone believed could not travel so far, fight, and then return to England. The Inner Reich was supposed to be the Luftwaffe's safe hunting ground. Then a voice cut across his headphones. At 12 o'clock, high single-engine fighters with drop tanks. The tone was afraid. Kogler felt his blood run cold. Single-engine fighters here, not far from Berlin. According to every range chart in Luftwaffe briefing rooms, that was impossible. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the main escort fighter, could barely touch German airspace before fuel reserves forced it to turn back. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms and better economy, might reach Hanover on a good day. But Brandenburg, let alone Berlin, lay far beyond the edge of their known envelope. For years, German planners had lived by a simple equation: fuel capacity divided by consumption rate equals range. They knew how much fuel American fighters could carry, and how quickly those engines drank it. From those numbers, they drew a hard line on the map. Beyond roughly 280 miles from English bases, escort fighters would have to peel away, leaving bomber formations alone over central and eastern Germany. That inner zone was where Luftwaffe pilots formed large groups, climbed above and ahead of the bombers, and then tore into the box formations without interference. Now that mental map was breaking apart. As sunlight flashed off distant shapes, Kogler strained against his harness and saw silhouettes that did not match any known pattern. The wings were not rounded like thunderbolts, nor split into twin tails like lightnings. The machines ahead were long and sleek, with squared tips and slender noses. They were North American P-51B Mustangs. They did not lumber along on the edge of their endurance. They moved with the assurance of predators that knew they had fuel to spare and altitude in hand. Behind and around them, more than 700 heavy bombers drove straight toward Berlin, not feinting and turning away, but heading directly for the capital. And for the first time in the history of air warfare, single-engine fighters were escorting them all the way in and all the way back out. In one glance, Kogler understood that this was more than a dangerous raid. It was proof that distance no longer protected the Reich. Something deeper than tactics had changed. The shock that gripped his formation had been building for weeks inside combat reports that senior officers in Berlin chose to ignore. In early January 1944, Major Hermann Graf of Jagdgeschwader 11 reported American single-engine fighters near Brunswick, about 150 miles deeper into Germany than the known escort range allowed. His superiors chalked the report up to combat fatigue and filed it away. Yet similar encounters kept coming. American fighters near Hanover on January 29th, moreover Magdeburg on February 3rd. Each one pushed the supposed edge of American fighter range farther east. Instead of reconsidering their assumptions, the Reich Air Ministry doubled down. On February 15th, it issued a directive stating that reports of American single-engine fighters beyond the Ruhr were misidentifications of twin-engine P-38s, or friendly aircraft, and that pilots who insisted otherwise would be sent for medical evaluation. The official response to a new reality over Germany was to declare that reality itself was unacceptable. Meanwhile, the truth was taking shape an ocean away. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers working with North American Aviation and Packard had achieved what many German specialists said could not be done. They had extended the combat radius of the P-51B Mustang to well over 650 miles by adding expendable auxiliary fuel tanks. On paper, it looked as if the Americans had somehow broken the rules. How could a single-engine fighter fly roughly 1,300 miles round-trip and still retain the performance needed to battle first-class interceptors? Luftwaffe officers, such as Hauptmann Heinz Nock, felt secure behind their arithmetic. Fuel capacity divided by consumption equals range. The Americans, they believed, could not change the laws of physics. From that came the conclusion that there would always be a wide zone over Germany where bombers would fly without escort. What they had not imagined was that the enemy would change everything around that equation: the engine, the fuel system, and the way fuel itself was carried into battle. Two innovations made the Mustangs' leap into the German heartland possible, and German intelligence had either missed them or dismissed them. The first was the Packard-built Merlin engine that turned the P-51 from a decent low-level fighter into a superb high-altitude escort. The Packard V1650-3 was more than a license copy. Built with mass production techniques developed in Detroit, it delivered close to 1,500 horsepower at sea level and still produced well over 1,200 horsepower near 30,000 feet while remaining efficient enough for long-range cruise. When Oberfeldwebel Konrad Bauer of Jagdgeschwader 26 examined a crashed P-51B near Gütersloh in February 1944, his technical report read like a reluctant compliment. He called the engine installation a masterpiece of efficient engineering, with an intercooler system more sophisticated than anything in the Daimler-Benz 605, powering the German Bf 109. Most unsettling of all was his conclusion that every component seemed machined to jeweler's precision, yet intelligence claimed the Americans were building several of these engines every hour. If that was true, Bauer warned the air war would be decided not by individual skill but by factories. The second innovation was even more revealing. British engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had developed a laminated paper drop tank impregnated with resin that could safely hold aviation fuel for several hours. Each 108-gallon tank weighed only about 35 pounds empty, less than the ammunition for a single Mustang machine gun. Two such tanks under the wings gave a P-51 the endurance to reach Berlin loiter and then still enter combat with a full internal fuel load once the tanks were jettisoned. German designers also built auxiliary tanks, but their tanks were metal, reusable, and relatively expensive. They were heavier, created more drag, and degraded performance so much that a fighter carrying them was vulnerable until it could get rid of them. In a system obsessed with conserving scarce materials, these metal tanks were treated as assets to be protected, not cheap tools to be thrown away. American planners treated fuel tanks the way they treated ammunition. The paper tanks were expendable. A P-51B could cruise across the North Sea and over the Ruhr on those external tanks. At the first sign of enemy fighters, the pilot could punch the release, see the tanks tumble away, and instantly have a clean, fully fueled, high-performance fighter in the middle of airspace that German doctrine claimed as its own. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, one of the most respected American group commanders, explained the change in mindset simply. The Luftwaffe, he said, expected American pilots to treat fuel like misers, always counting every gallon to ensure they had just enough for a short fight and the long trip home. With drop tanks, Mustang pilots could burn fuel like millionaires. They could cruise to Berlin on the external tanks, abandon them without a second thought, and still have enough internal fuel for a long engagement and the flight back to England. They were no longer flying on the edge of endurance. They had margin, and in air, combat margin meant freedom. To see why this hit the Luftwaffe so hard on March 6th, we need to look back to a day that had seemed to prove the opposite lesson. On October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force sent just under 300 B-17 Flying Fortresses toward the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt without adequate long-range escort. 60 bombers were shot down, and more than 130 were badly damaged. Over 600 airmen were killed, wounded, or captured in a single mission. The message appeared clear. Unescorted daylight precision bombing against deep German targets was unsustainable. In the aftermath, General Ira Eker halted deep raids. For Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters that day felt like theory vindicated by wreckage. In his memoir, he later wrote that after Schweinfurt, they believed they had proven daylight precision bombing a failure. The Americans, he argued, would have to join the British in night bombing, where accuracy was poor and damage to industry limited. German doctrine seemed secure. Galland made one crucial mistake. He assumed the Americans would accept the limits of 1943. When reports of a new long-range fighter reached his desk in December, and when his own pilots reported single-engine fighters over Hanover in January, he dismissed them. They must have seen twin-engine P-38s, he insisted, or they were imagining things. The arithmetic was too comforting to abandon. Only during the offensive the Americans called Big Week, beginning in late February 1944, did the scale of the change become undeniable. The 8th Air Force launched about 1,000 bombers, with more than 800 escort fighters, including the first large-scale deployment of P-51Bs. Over 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost roughly 260 fighters, and far more importantly around 100 experienced pilots, a slice of its veteran cadre it could never replace. From that point on, every mission against the bomber streams was a struggle not only to reach the bombers through an escort screen, but to survive the way back through that same wall of Mustangs. That was the reality hanging above Brandenburg when Hans Kogler looked up and saw sleek silver fighters where empty sky was supposed to be and felt the familiar mathematics of safety vanish in a heartbeat. The morning of March 6, 1944 broke with a clarity that felt almost symbolic. High above the English countryside, the airfields of the 8th Air Force shimmered under a pale sky as crews of the 357th Fighter Group prepared for what many already sensed would be a historic mission. Mechanics moved between rows of Mustangs with purposeful focus, checking fuel lines, tightening cowling fasteners, and inspecting the shimmering surfaces of wings and stabilizers. Pilots strapped into their cockpits not with routine anticipation but with the sober understanding that they were about to attempt something no escort fighter group had ever achieved: a full-distance penetration to Berlin, the forbidden heart of the Reich. Before the engines turned, Colonel Donald Spicer gathered his pilots for a briefing that carried none of the usual informal optimism. He laid out the mission parameters with unflinching clarity. They would be over enemy territory for 4 hours, far from diversion fields and rescue possibilities. There would be no second chances, no margin for mechanical failure or navigational error. Every aircraft had to perform flawlessly. Every pilot had to maintain discipline across hundreds of miles of hostile airspace. Escorting the bomber formations to Berlin and back was not simply a duty, it was the test for which the P-51 Mustang had been created. But fate intervened almost immediately. Shortly after takeoff, Spicer was forced to abort the mission due to mechanical trouble. The responsibility for leading the group fell instantly to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Hayes, a man known for relentless aggression in the air and calm decisiveness under pressure. Without hesitation, he stepped into command, guiding the Mustangs upward as they joined one of the largest aerial armadas ever assembled. Hundreds of heavy bombers, accompanied by waves of escort fighters, stretched across the sky in a formation that seemed to embody the industrial might of the United States. The climb eastward, though beautiful, was treacherous. The weather over the North Sea and northern Germany twisted into thick, deceptive clouds that swallowed entire squadrons. Fine sheets of moisture, nearly invisible, formed layers of ice on wings and canopies. Instruments fogged. Pilots relied more on instinct than on visibility. By the time Hayes broke into clear skies on the German side of the weather front, nearly 1/3 of his Mustangs had been forced to turn back or divert. What should have been a full escort group had become a reduced force spread thin across the massive bomber stream. Still, Hayes pressed forward. The Berlin mission could not wait. Enough Mustangs had made it through, and that was enough to continue. Meanwhile, German controllers manning radar stations across central Germany analyzed the approaching formations. The American armada was enormous, but Luftwaffe officers had seen similar patterns before. Their first assumption was that this was another feint, an attempt to draw fighters away from the western industrial zones, while another force struck elsewhere. For that reason, many fighter units were held on the ground, their pilots ordered to conserve precious fuel until the true target was confirmed. Some commanders even kept aircraft under shelters, unwilling to risk unnecessary scrambles, while the Reife's gasoline reserves dwindled. In the early phase of the mission, everything unfolded exactly as the Luftwaffe expected. German fighters shadowed the bomber stream and engaged its forward escort elements, waiting for the traditional moment when the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and Lockheed P-38 Lightnings would peel away near the limits of their range. Once those escorts turned back toward England, the bombers would be exposed. That was the pattern of the past, and German intercept doctrine was built around exploiting that inevitable moment of vulnerability. As radar operators confirmed that the Thunderbolts indeed turned westward, Major Hans Kogler committed his fighters with full confidence. The stage seemed set for a classic interception, German fighters closing from above, bombers locked in formation, and the airspace ahead supposedly clear of American single-engine fighters. Everything about the situation echoed the raids of the previous year. Allied fighters were assumed to be out of fuel or nearly at their combat limit. German squadrons prepared to dive. But this time the old pattern betrayed them. Just as Kogler moved his formation into attack position, Hayes and the surviving Mustangs burst through the high cloud layers and saw the bomber stream ahead glinting in the sunlight. Even more striking were the dark, swirling shapes of a large Luftwaffe formation preparing to descend. Hayes immediately understood that timing had become everything. If he waited only moments longer, dozens of German fighters would be upon the bombers. He barked a command through his radio-jettisoned drop tanks. Metal clamps released and the slender tanks tumbled away, glittering like falling coins in the bright air. In one smooth movement, the Mustangs transformed from long-range escorts into lethal, fully fueled fighters. The sight of those falling tanks has been remembered by German pilot Heinz Müller as the moment his disbelief ended. At first, he assumed the aircraft above him were misidentified, Lightnings or some new twin-engine type. But when the silver cylinders began dropping through the sunlight, and he saw their shape and number realization struck with a force he later compared to a punch in the chest. Only one Allied fighter used those tanks. Only one could discard them at that altitude with such confidence. They were P-51 Mustangs deep inside Germany with enough fuel to fight. Within seconds, the engagement became a brutal ambush. The Mustangs held the altitude advantage, the initiative, and the element of total surprise. Hayes rolled his aircraft downward, leading his group in a slashing dive that cut straight across the Luftwaffe formation. Tracers stitched through the sky. German fighters broke apart in panic, some diving, some climbing, some turning too sharply and bleeding precious energy. The discipline that normally held German formations together collapsed in the face of an enemy they believed they would never see at this range. In the next minutes, the sky turned into a mosaic of twisting battles. The 357th Fighter Group destroyed 20 German aircraft without losing a single Mustang. After the initial strikes, Hayes continued to press the attack, diving after engines that were smoking and leading strafing runs against fighters attempting to escape at low altitude. For the Luftwaffe pilots, many of whom had never seen a Mustang up close, the experience felt unreal, almost supernatural. They were fighting an enemy who should not have been there at all. News of the engagement reached Berlin within hours, and Hermann Göring's reaction became legend. He initially dismissed the reports as exaggerations from frightened pilots, accusing them of cowardice or of confusing Mustangs with twin-engine aircraft. He ordered his officers to recheck every detail, insisting that the range figures for American fighters were unchanged. But when he stepped outside and stared into the pale sky himself, he saw thin white contrails arcing high above the capital. They were American contrails drawn by fighters who had arrived with the bombers and remained long after the Thunderbolts turned away. For nearly an hour, Göring watched in silence, understanding but unwilling to accept the truth. When he returned inside, he issued an order so infamous that Luftwaffe officers would later recall it with disbelief. Any pilot reporting American single-engine fighters over Berlin would be arrested. German commanders, half frustrated and half amused, quietly instructed their men to report all sightings as twin-engine aircraft instead. It was an absurd attempt to protect a worldview collapsing under the weight of physical evidence. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, had no patience for denial. When he was summoned to explain the situation, he arrived carrying a piece of laminated fuel tank that had been recovered from a field near the capital. Stamped on the curved surface were the words, "Made in United States of America." He placed the fragment on the table before Göring without saying a word. The argument ended there. Later, Galland admitted that the moment he saw Mustangs over Berlin, he knew the war was lost. The Luftwaffe could adapt tactics, develop new aircraft and train new pilots, but it could not outfly the mathematics of industrial capacity and range. For German pilots who survived that day, the psychological consequences were immediate and profound. They had been raised on the belief that the Inner Reich was a fortress defended by superior engineering and a fighter force unmatched in skill. Now the one sanctuary they believed untouchable had been violated. A diary entry from a pilot in Yugoslavia 54 captured the new reality with a stark simplicity. There are no safe zones left. We are hunted everywhere, even above our own capital. That realization spread like a cold current through mess halls and briefing rooms. Pilots who once felt mastery over familiar skies now looked upward with a sense of dread. The horizon no longer guaranteed safety. The myth of German air superiority, built over years of combat and reinforced through endless propaganda, shattered in a single morning. And in that shattered space, a new and darker understanding took shape. The enemy had not only reached Berlin, the enemy had changed the nature of the sky itself. The shock that had settled over the Luftwaffe after the first appearance of the Mustang deep inside the Reich only grew darker as pilots returned to their bases and compared accounts. What they had witnessed above Berlin was not a fleeting anomaly, nor a fortunate gust of wind carrying a few American fighters slightly farther than expected. It was the beginning of a new reality in which the technical superiority of the P-51B redefined every aspect of aerial warfare. Over Berlin, the Mustang demonstrated in unforgiving clarity that it was faster than the Messerschmitt 109G-6, handled better at high altitude, delivered a crushing weight of heavy-caliber fire, and perhaps most decisively of all was flown by pilots who were not exhausted by the constant pressure of fuel starvation. These American flyers entered combat with full internal tanks and the confidence that they could fight, disengage, re-engage, and still return home. German survivors from that first brutal encounter described the Mustangs with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. They recalled how the American fighters always seemed to arrive from above, diving with immense stored energy, unleashing concentrated bursts of fire, and then climbing away with impossible ease. Again and again German pilots noted that the Mustangs behaved as though gravity itself favored them. When a German fighter banked sharply to escape, the Mustang followed. When a Messerschmitt tried to dive away, the Mustang stayed glued to its tail. And when a German pilot attempted to pull up steeply, the Mustang simply continued rising, climbing vertically with a power margin that German engines could no longer match. It was as if the American pilots were flying machines that ignored the traditional boundaries of combat altitude and maneuver. But the technical advantage was only one part of the psychological blow. Even more devastating was the sudden realization that these American fighters did not need to break off after a single pass. Earlier, escorts such as the P-47 Thunderbolt or the P-38 Lightning were powerful, but their fuel constraints forced them to conserve energy and disengage after a limited engagement. The Mustangs, by contrast, made repeated passes following German fighters all the way down to treetop level if necessary. No dive was safe. No low-altitude escape was guaranteed. The American pilots attacked as though they owned the entire sky from cloud top to ground haze, and in a very real sense they did. The Luftwaffe quickly understood that its traditional tactics could no longer function. There would be no more leisurely positioning miles ahead of the bomber stream, no more carefully coordinated mass dives in perfect formation, no more assumption that escorts would eventually turn back and leave the bombers exposed. From this point forward, German pilots had to assume that every bomber formation carried Mustangs hidden somewhere above or behind, waiting with cold patience for any sign of attack. It forced the Luftwaffe into rushed engagements, increasing losses even before the fighting began. Pilots had to dive immediately with whatever formations they could muster, knowing they might be intercepted before they even reached firing range. At the very moment when the Mustangs asserted dominance over the skies, Germany was facing a worsening crisis on the ground that would cripple its ability to respond. The Reich was almost entirely dependent on synthetic fuel plants that converted coal into aviation gasoline using the hydrogenation process. These vast industrial complexes were engineering marvels, but they were also stationary giants, hard to move, difficult to defend, and essential to every German aircraft in the sky. Before the arrival of the P-51, these plants had enjoyed a kind of accidental safety. They were located too deep within the Reich for escorted daylight bombers to reach. Unescorted, the heavy bombers were far too vulnerable, and the hardened concrete structures could resist inaccurate night bombing. As long as escort fighters lacked the necessary range, German fuel production remained secure. The Mustang changed that equation overnight. On May 12, 1944, the 8th Air Force proved the new reality. Protected by hundreds of P-51s, American bombers struck the synthetic fuel plant at Lona with unprecedented precision. The result was catastrophic for Germany. Production dropped by 90% in a single day. It was not simply a blow, it was a decapitation strike. The Luftwaffe's lifeblood had been cut. Within weeks, aviation fuel production across the Reich collapsed. What had once been 175,000 tons per month fell to 35,000 by June. By September, it plummeted to 7,000 tons. It was impossible to sustain a modern air force on such famine rations. What followed was a slow suffocation of German air power. Training flights were cancelled. Formation practice was eliminated. Gunnery training became a luxury. New pilots arrived at their units with barely any experience. Veterans wrote bitterly about the young men assigned to them, men who had never fired their weapons in flight, never performed controlled aerobatics, and never trained in actual combat maneuvers. They were unprepared, frightened, and disastrously vulnerable. Even the bravest of them had no chance against seasoned Mustang pilots who accumulated hundreds of hours in the cockpit before seeing combat. The Luftwaffe was losing more than fuel. It was losing the intangible core that defined a fighting force, confidence, cohesion, and skill. The experience that once allowed German aces to dominate over Europe was evaporating. Every sortie cost pilots. Every fight drained resources. Every mission bled away the last reserves of talent the Luftwaffe desperately needed. The consequences became unmistakable on June 6, 1944 D-Day. As the greatest amphibious invasion in human history unfolded across the beaches of Normandy, the skies above told the true story of air supremacy. Allied aircraft flew nearly 15,000 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe, crippled by fuel shortage and Mustang dominance, managed only 319. 35 of those were lost in combat. Over the invasion beaches, only 2 German fighters appeared during the entire day. 2. Their brief strafing run performed by Joseph Priller and his wingman has become legendary, not because it turned the tide, but because it highlighted the Luftwaffe's near-total absence. German leaders were brutally honest after the war. They admitted that the Luftwaffe had lost its initiative months before the invasion on the very day Mustangs appeared over Berlin. Everything afterward was a downward spiral retreat, improvisation, and desperate measures. Among the most desperate were the Sturmgruppe units equipped with heavily armoured Focke-Wulf 190A-8 fighters. These machines were flying tanks designed to endure defensive fire long enough to reach bomber formations and destroy them at point-blank range. Their tactic was brutal: fly straight through the escort screen, absorb damage and fire at such close range that a hit was almost guaranteed. On July 7, 1944, a Sturmgruppe attack succeeded in destroying an entire squadron of B-24 bombers in under 1 minute. The price was horrific. 9 attacking fighters were shot down and 3 crash-landed. The survivors described the experience as a form of madness, charging forward in slow, armor-laden aircraft, while lighter, faster Mustangs tore into them from every direction. Soon those same units became death traps. The armor made them slow. The Mustangs, with their superior energy and maneuverability, carved them apart. German command even issued ramming orders, instructing pilots to sacrifice themselves if their guns jammed or failed. But many never got close enough. They were intercepted, isolated, and destroyed long before reaching the bombers. Desperation turned eyes toward revolutionary technology, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. In theory, it was a miracle. It was faster than any Allied aircraft by a wide margin and could easily outclimb and outrun the Mustang. But Hitler insisted on using it as a fast bomber, delaying its deployment as an interceptor for months. By the time it finally entered service, there were too few jets, too little fuel, and too many Allied fighters waiting near every German airfield. Jet pilots described the haunting experience of taking off in a miracle machine only to return and find Mustangs circling overhead like hawks waiting to strike during the vulnerable moments of landing. Even elite units such as Gallen's JV-44 could not change the outcome. They scored victories, but they were hunted relentlessly. Against the overwhelming air presence of the Allies, technological brilliance meant little without fuel training or safe runways. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was suffering what historians would later call the death of the expert. Veteran pilots, men with dozens or even hundreds of victories, were dying faster than Germany could train replacements. New pilots arrived with as little as 20 hours of flight time in their aircraft, barely able to maintain formation, let alone fight. American pilots, by contrast, crossed the Atlantic with 400 to 500 hours in their logbooks, many of them spent in rigorous gunnery and combat training. The mismatch was so extreme that Johannes Steinhoff later described the situation with bitter candor. "We were sending children to their deaths. The Mustangs overhead did more than dominate the skies, they exposed." The Luftwaffe's collapse accelerated its destruction and revealed the growing desperation of a force that had once embodied German power. And as the months continued, the consequences would only deepen. The collapse of German air power, once feared across Europe, became undeniable when survival itself turned into a statistical improbability. By early 1945, the average life expectancy of a newly assigned Luftwaffe pilot had shrunk to barely 7 missions. Some fighter units, once renowned for their elite rosters, were losing their entire complement of pilots within a single month. The devastating attrition was no longer a matter of bad luck or isolated misfortune. It reflected a structural unraveling so complete that stepping into the cockpit had become less an act of duty and more an acceptance of a near-certain fate. One young pilot described in his diary how his so-called training flight over the region near Brunswick became his first and nearly last experience of combat. He had expected a routine familiarization with the skies, a controlled environment in which veteran pilots would show him basic patrol procedures. Instead, the formation was ambushed almost immediately by diving Mustangs. He never saw the American fighters until tracer rounds flashed past his canopy. His flight leader was killed in the first burst. Panicked, he dove to treetop level and fled alone, skimming the ground in terror until he reached his home field. That frantic escape constituted the entirety of his combat training. Such stories were no longer rare, they had become the norm. While German pilots struggled simply to survive, American strategy shifted into a relentless tempo of industrial destruction. The long range of the Mustang meant that factories in Regensburg, Leipzig, Augsburg, and other deep interior production centers were no longer sheltered by distance. Again and again, waves of bombers escorted without fail by Mustangs struck engine plants, assembly halls, and transportation hubs. The German aircraft industry, already stretched thin, soon found itself the target of attacks occurring with such regularity that repair crews could barely return a facility to partial function before it was hit again. Albert Speer, the Reich Minister for Armaments, later confirmed that Mustang-escorted bombing produced a kind of continuous industrial pressure Germany could not relieve. No sooner was a building patched, machinery recalibrated, or supply lines restored than American aircraft reappeared overhead. In desperation, German planners began dispersing production into forests, hillside caverns, mines, and makeshift underground chambers. But this solution created new problems. Dispersed factories lacked efficient supply chains, quality control, or standardized processes. Speer later acknowledged that dispersal reduced industrial efficiency by nearly 3/4. What had once been a modern manufacturing system devolved into a patchwork of hidden workshops plagued by shortages, sabotage, and substandard materials. Ironically, even as production numbers reached their late-war peak, thousands of fighters rolling off assembly lines each month, the Luftwaffe found itself unable to keep pace. Losses in the air, on the ground, and in transport exceeded output. The new aircraft that did arrive were often defective. Pilots complained of engines that failed during takeoff control surfaces that jammed mid-flight, and guns that fired erratically or not at all. What should have been Germany's technological spearhead became a procession of flying death traps, as one veteran called them. When Kurt Tank, the brilliant designer behind the Fokker-Wulf line, visited frontline units in late 1944, he was horrified. He observed exhausted workers toiling with inferior alloys, missing tools, and limited oversight. He discovered aircraft rolling out of dispersed factories with misaligned frames, warped wings, and engines that barely met minimal test standards. The proud engineering culture that once defined German aviation had collapsed beneath the weight of scarcity and pressure. In the face of this decline, Operation Bodenplatte emerged as the Luftwaffe's final gamble, a massive New Year's Day assault in 1945 meant to cripple Allied air power on the ground. Nearly every remaining fighter in the West participated in the attack. It was a plan born of desperation, secrecy, and misplaced hope. And while Bodenplatte initially achieved surprising tactical success, destroying hundreds of Allied aircraft parked on airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands, it quickly devolved into catastrophe. The operation was so secret that German flak batteries had not been informed. As a result, dozens of German fighters were shot down by their own anti-aircraft guns before they even reached their targets. The deeper tragedy of Bodenplatte was that Allied losses were easily replaceable. Within days, new aircraft, new engines, and new pilots filled the gaps. The Luftwaffe, however, had gambled its remaining strength and lost. More than 200 pilots were killed or captured, many of them seasoned leaders whose experience could never be replaced. The operation burned precious fuel reserves, leaving the Air Force so depleted that it ceased to function as an effective fighting force. After Bodenplatte, the skies of Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. Mustang units swiftly exploited the Luftwaffe's weakness, sweeping across airfields and destroying the grounded remnants of German fighter wings. Allied pilots described the following weeks as surreal and grim. They encountered airfields packed with aircraft that lacked fuel to take off. Strafing runs became one-sided executions. Pilots later admitted that far from feeling triumph, they experienced a somber heaviness as they destroyed row after row of silent fighters. Coordinated Luftwaffe operations disintegrated. Without fuel, without trained pilots, and without command and control infrastructure, the German air arm devolved into scattered, isolated sorties flown by individuals with no strategic impact. For many pilots, refusal became the only rational choice. They knew that taking off meant almost certain death. With no hope of altering the course of the war, some quietly disobeyed orders or feigned mechanical failures to avoid pointless sacrifice. Those who continued flying did so with the grim understanding that they were participating in a ritual of destruction, not a defense of the Reich. The emotional toll was devastating. One diary entry from a surviving pilot expressed a depth of despair rarely seen even in wartime writing. He mourned the loss of friends he had trained with, fought beside, laughed with, and considered brothers. He wrote that he no longer felt like a hunter of the sky, but a target suspended beneath the omnipresent Mustangs. He understood that his life was measured not in years or even months, but in sorties. Luftwaffe strength figures from this period reveal the scale of annihilation. At the beginning of 1944, approximately 2,400 fighter pilots were operational. By January of 1945, that number had fallen to roughly 700. By April, barely 200 remained. Of the pilots who had been operational in January 1944, fewer than 5% survived the war uninjured. In statistical terms, the Luftwaffe no longer existed as a meaningful force. After the war, German pilots spoke with surprising candor about the Mustang. Allied intelligence officers, historians, and post-war interviewers collected testimony that painted a consistent narrative. Again and again, Luftwaffe veterans referred to the P-51 as the decisive element that broke German air power. Adolf Galland, the famed general of fighters who had once argued fiercely with Hermann Göring, stated in a 1954 interview that the Mustang was the decisive weapon of the air war. It was not the absolute best in turning, climbing, rolling, or speed, he admitted, but it was very good in every category and unrivaled in range. Its ability to appear anywhere, at any altitude, at virtually any hour, made it the equivalent of having multiple queen pieces on a chessboard while the opponent was restricted to pawns. Johannes Steinhoff, who later became a prominent leader in the post-war German Air Force and served as chairman of the NATO Military Committee, offered an equally blunt assessment. He explained that the Mustang destroyed the very foundation of German air superiority doctrine. Everything the Luftwaffe had built, training tactics, interception strategy, depended on the assumption that Germany's heartland remained beyond the reach of single-engine fighters. When that assumption collapsed, the entire defensive architecture disintegrated. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came decades later, when former adversaries met not as enemies but as veterans sharing a common history. Heinz Nock, whose wartime diary had captured the emotional arc from confidence to despair, met Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson of the 357th Fighter Group, one of the aces who had escorted bombers over Berlin. Noak told him that the moment he first saw Mustangs above the capital felt like witnessing the collapse of an entire worldview. Everything he had been taught about German superiority evaporated. The appearance of those silver fighters did not simply defeat Germany in the air, it tore down the illusion upon which the Luftwaffe had been built, and in that acknowledgement lay the final truth: the Mustang had not merely won battles, it had reshaped the psychological, strategic, and industrial landscape of the war. The shockwave that began over Berlin reverberated through every corner of the collapsing Reich, signaling not only the end of Germany's air force but the end of its myth of invincibility. In the final months of the war, when the Luftwaffe's world had already shrunk to a handful of airfields and a fading circle of veterans, Heinz Noak tried to explain what it felt like to witness the transformation of the sky. He wrote that the Mustangs appeared not as individual fighters, but as an endless ocean of power rolling forward with the certainty of a tide that could not be turned back. The realization cut deeply distance once Germany's greatest shield no longer mattered. The belief that Allied aircraft were fragile, poorly built, or flown by inexperienced aviators, beliefs reinforced by years of propaganda, collapsed under the undeniable truth roaring overhead. The Mustang's presence was not merely an enemy arrival, it was the physical manifestation of a lie unraveling. For Germany's remaining aces, even legendary figures like Erich Hartmann's survival demanded a painful shift in tactics. Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter pilot in history, avoided the Mustangs with a caution that bordered on reverence. He struck only under perfect conditions, when the sun masked his approach, when the American escorts were momentarily distracted, or when he could dive unseen from above. The moment Mustangs appeared, he disengaged without hesitation. For Hartmann, combat against them ceased to be an arena for victory. It became a matter of endurance, a test of how long he could continue to fight, while avoiding the hunters who dominated the middle and upper altitudes. Hartmann later described Mustang encounters not as battles but as episodes of pure survival. He acknowledged that the Allies controlled every category of advantage: altitude numbers, fuel reserves, and increasingly quality of training. German pilots, drained by years of attrition and flying on dwindling fuel supplies, simply could not match the Americans' rate of improvement. The air war had reached a point where courage alone no longer mattered. Statistics compiled after the war put hard numbers to the impression every pilot had felt in his bones. The P-51 achieved nearly 5,000 confirmed aerial victories and destroyed more than 4,000 German aircraft on the ground. Almost half of all United States Army Air Force's fighter claims in the European theater were credited to Mustangs. The scale of their impact was not measured in isolated duels, but in the systemic dismantling of an entire air force. Loss and protection rates further illustrated the shift in the balance of power. The Mustang's loss rate per sortie remained astonishingly low, while Luftwaffe losses skyrocketed. Heavy bomber losses plummeted from 9.1% during deep penetrations to roughly 2.5% after the Mustang arrived in force. This was not a marginal improvement, it was a transformation of daylight strategic bombing from near impossible to routinely achievable. Range figures completed the picture of total domination. The P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were fearsome weapons, but their combat radius limited them to the western edges of Germany. The P-51's range, enhanced by lightweight drop tanks, extended deep into the heart of the Reich. The P-51D model, with refined aerodynamics and more efficient fuel systems, could reach every major target in Germany, while still retaining enough reserves to fight. For the Luftwaffe, this meant that no region, no matter how distant, could be considered safe. Training disparities widened the gap to an unbridgeable gulf. American pilots often arrived in Europe with 400 to 500 hours of flight time, having trained extensively in aerobatics formation, flying, and gunnery. German trainees, constrained by fuel rationing and collapsing infrastructure, sometimes arrived with fewer than 50 hours. It was not uncommon for a German pilot to face an opponent with 10 times his experience. General Karl Spaatz captured the essence of this moment when he declared that the Mustang enabled true air supremacy, not merely localized superiority. For the first time in the war, the Allies could strike any target at any time and acceptably absorb whatever losses might occur. The Luftwaffe no longer dictated when or where it would fight. The initiative had shifted irrevocably. This supremacy had profound effects on German morale. Civilians watched unopposed Mustangs weaving through the skies above their cities, their polished wings glinting like cold silver against the daylight. Soldiers on the ground learned to associate the Mustang's silhouette with inevitable attack. Every train, every convoy, every exposed unit lived under the threat of sudden destruction. The psychological weight was immense. Many wrote in letters that they felt hunted as though the sky itself had turned against them. Strategic consequences accumulated rapidly. The Mustang's escort capabilities enabled repeated systematic strikes that paralyzed industry transportation and energy networks. Rail yards shattered. Factories that had taken years to construct were smashed in minutes. Canals clogged with wreckage. Each attack slowed Germany's ability to repair the damage from the last one. Over time, the cumulative effects grew into a suffocating paralysis. The most devastating outcome of all came from the feedback loop created by the destruction of fuel plants. Without aviation, gasoline new pilots could not train. Without training, they died quickly. Without experienced pilots, Germany could not defend its skies. And without defense, Allied bombers struck fuel production again, tightening the noose. It was a cycle that fed on itself until the Luftwaffe became a hollow shell. On the ground, Allied operations benefited enormously. The breakout from Normandy, the advance across France, the encirclement of German units, and the crossing of the Rhine were all made far easier by the Mustang's presence. German forces were forced to move primarily at night, greatly reducing their mobility and coordination. In daylight, they were simply too vulnerable. Perhaps the most devastating intangible effect was the shattering of German myths. From the war's beginning, the Messerschmitt 109 had outclassed most opponents. German pilots were superbly trained, and their Finger 4 formations were innovative and deadly. For years, Germany had dominated the air through both skill and technology. Now civilians could look upward and see the truth contradicting propaganda in real time. Unopposed Mustangs drifted over cities that had once seemed untouchable. The Mustang itself represented the opposite of the Nazi system, a multinational fusion of innovation and mass production. The British Merlin engine, refined in the crucible of combat, merged with American manufacturing capacity and a relentless feedback loop of field reports, engineering corrections, and tactical analysis. Each version of the Mustang was not a new aircraft, but an evolution shaped directly by lessons from the front line. The P-51D embodied these refinements. Its bubble canopy eliminated blind spots. Its 6 heavy-caliber guns delivered devastating fire. Its K-14 gunsight improved accuracy to a degree that stunned German pilots. Strengthened wings, improved radios, and a more powerful Merlin engine turned it into a near-perfect synthesis of range, performance, and firepower. By contrast, the Nazi air development system collapsed into chaos. American production lines could refine and iterate within weeks. German programs like the Ta-152 or the Me-262 struggled to reach full potential because factories lacked materials, engineers were overextended, and prototypes arrived too late to matter. Hitler's obsession with bombers further derailed fighter development, while outspoken aces who told the truth were punished rather than heeded. The result was predictable. One by one, Germany's greatest aces fell in the Mustang era. Klaus Meertusch, whose score had once seemed untouchable, died at the hands of a P-51 during the defense of Berlin. Others followed. Their deaths were not isolated tragedies, but symptoms of a collapsing system. Earlier losses had already signaled a turning tide. Walter Oso, the famed 127 victory ace, was shot down by P-38s. Hans Philipp, another giant, fell to P-47s. These deaths foreshadowed the growing lethality of Allied fighters and the weakening of German defensive structures. By the end of the war, attrition had erased nearly all of Germany's top-scoring pilots. Those who had achieved more than 100 victories were largely dead, wounded, or captured. Their institutional memory years of combat experience, tactical innovation, and leadership disappeared with them. What remained was a haunting legacy, the final, irrefutable proof that the Mustang had done more than defeat the Luftwaffe. It had dismantled the mythology, strategy, and structure of the German Air Force from the inside out. It had reached into the deepest sanctuaries of the Reich and revealed that no fortress, no belief, and no distance could protect a system built on denial from the consequences of reality. And in the silence that followed, the roar of the Mustang became not only the sound of victory, but the sound of an age ending. By the beginning of 1945, the Luftwaffe existed more on paper than in the sky. Its airfields were scattered fragments, its aircraft dispersed beneath nets of camouflage stretched across forests, fields, and abandoned industrial yards. Pilots travelled constantly from one hidden strip to another, never knowing where they would sleep the next night or whether fuel would reach them by morning. The once proud air arm of Europe, which had terrorized nations at the war's outset, now resembled a hunted tribe moving from shadow to shadow, existing only in the margins carved out by Allied mercy or neglect. This terminal decline seeped into the Reich's own regulations, producing orders that revealed how thoroughly confidence had evaporated. Pilots were instructed to limit their flights to minutes at a time, lest the fuel tanks run dry or the Mustangs catch their scent. Any pilot who stayed in the air longer than instructed was presumed a defector, a deserter, or a man attempting to flee the sky before he was torn from it. The fear of the Mustang seeped so deeply into policy that bureaucratic procedures became indistinguishable from panic. The skies of the Reich were no longer governed by doctrine or strategy, but by dread. For the pilots who still flew, success itself began to feel hollow. Even on the rare days when a unit managed to strike a target or chase away a formation of bombers, the sense of victory dissolved quickly. The bombers came again the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. Behind them, as constant as breath, came the Mustangs. The cycle had become mechanical, predictable, implacable. To many German aviators, the war seemed less like a contest and more like a sentence being carried out. Meanwhile, American fighter tactics evolved into piercing efficiency. Reports from the final months of the war described scenes in which Mustangs finished off burning or crippled German aircraft, not out of cruelty but from an understanding that allowing any survivor to return meant risking the emergence of a jet pilot, a night fighter expert, or an instructor capable of training a new generation. The rules of engagement had shifted. Mercy, once a hallmark of the chivalric code that early aviators romanticized, lost its place within a campaign defined by industrial annihilation. The Americans were determined to prevent the Luftwaffe from rising again in any form. Mustang pilots often spoke later of the distinct phases of the air campaign. In the early months, they had battled Germany's first-team aces, men with hundreds of missions behind them, flying expertly tuned machines hardened by years of brutal combat. But as 1944 faded into 1945, the character of the fighting changed. Increasingly, the pilots they encountered were young, uncertain, inadequately trained, and deeply fearful. Some Mustang pilots found themselves unable to shake the grim sense that they were shooting down students who had been sent aloft with barely enough flight hours to understand their instruments. By the final spring of the war, the effect of the Mustangs stretched beyond physical combat into psychological territory. German pilots, hearing reports that Mustangs were in the vicinity, sometimes refused to take off. Others fled the moment they spotted the telltale glint of a silver wing. American airmen observed that they could often scatter entire formations simply by diving boldly into the fray, knowing the enemy's morale had already cracked. It was a transformation of perception so complete that it became its own weapon. Even American legends recognized the Mustang's supremacy. Charles Yeager described flying a P-51 as equivalent to carrying a rifle into battle while the enemy clutched muskets. The differences were that stark speed, altitude, performance, fuel, range, firepower, and numerical advantage all combined to create an aircraft that was not merely better, it was in another category altogether. To Yeager and his contemporaries, the Mustang felt less like a tool than an inevitability, a machine that made victory feel almost predestined. Bomber crews echoed this sentiment with a depth of emotion that survives in their memoirs. Many remembered that before the Mustang arrived, missions deep into Germany had felt like suicide attempts wrapped in orders. Casualty rates were horrifying. The sky was a battlefield of flame, steel, and terror. But when the Mustangs appeared slicing into enemy formations and clearing a path through the chaos, relief washed through bomber cockpits like a physical force. Some crews openly wept when they saw their escorts overhead, knowing they were no longer alone. The Mustang did not merely protect them, It restored their humanity in a sky that had grown merciless. Behind this battlefield reality stood an industrial miracle. Mustang's success flowed as much from production as from design. North American aviation's factories at Inglewood and Dallas became temples of wartime efficiency. Assembly lines stretched farther than the eye could see, each section of the process broken into precise, repeatable motions borrowed directly from the automotive industry. Components moved along tracks with relentless rhythm, while workers, many of whom had never imagined they would contribute to aviation, performed specialized tasks with expert precision. Housewives who had once run kitchens, teenagers not yet old enough to vote, and older men long retired from heavy labor, all became integral to the Mustang's creation. Quality control inspectors stood at each juncture, ensuring that every rivet, weld, and panel met strict tolerances. This broad civilian participation gave the Mustang a democratic soul. It was not built by an elite cast of engineers in secret labs, but by the hands of everyday Americans answering a collective call. The contrast with German production could not have been more extreme. Factories forced into caves, forests, and abandoned mineshafts struggled to maintain consistency. Skilled workers were drafted into the army, replaced by coerced laborers whose resentment manifested in sabotage. Completed aircraft often arrived at airfields with fatal flaws, misfitted bolts, loose control cables, engines assembled with inferior alloys. The Luftwaffe's frontline units no longer trusted the machines they received. The Mustang's influence extended well beyond Europe. Both Japan and the Soviet Union studied it closely. The Soviet Air Force, which received small numbers of Mustangs through Lend-Lease, learned that long-range escorts were essential for modern warfare. Their post-war aircraft designs reflected this lesson. The P-51 itself, renamed the F-51, continued fighting in Korea and served in smaller air forces across the globe into the 1980s. It participated in Israeli operations and even fought as part of the Dominican arsenal, demonstrating that its fundamental design principles were timeless. Its long service life revealed something deeper than durability. The Mustang was not merely a fighter. It was a concept, a proof of what air power could be when range, firepower, speed, and industrial backing converged. It redefined the meaning of air superiority, showing that control of the sky must span entire nations, not just battlefields. It was not enough to win localized engagements. True dominance required the ability to appear everywhere, anytime, and in overwhelming numbers. Different groups experienced Mustangs over Berlin in profoundly different ways. To American pilots, it was triumph and vindication. Letters home described circling the German capital with a sense of ownership, as if the sky above the enemy's greatest city had become an unofficial American domain. They wrote of cruising above the streets, seeing the Brandenburg Gate from a vantage that would once have been unthinkable, and feeling history shift beneath their wings. For German pilots, the experience was the inverse. Letters captured their dread with chilling clarity. They wrote that there was no longer a single safe corner in the Reich. The once familiar routes they had flown for years became killing grounds. The idea of home airspace, once a comforting promise, disintegrated into a cruel joke. Some confessed that even the sound of an approaching engine sent waves of panic through their chest. German civilians, too, found their worldview unraveling. For years they had been told that America was weak, fragmented, and incapable of sustained warfare. But when they saw unopposed American fighters drifting above their neighborhoods, the illusion collapsed. Mothers walking children to market looked up and saw silver wings shining in the sun, proof that the Reich's promises had been hollow. For bomber crews, the Mustang became synonymous with survival itself. Many wrote that when they saw P-51's rendezvous with them over the heart of the Reich, they felt a surge of gratitude so intense that it brought them to tears. They had lived with the constant knowledge that any mission could be their last. But the sight of the Mustangs soaring in protective arcs around them banished despair. It replaced terror with hope. And in the final chapters of the war, hope was the most powerful currency a crew could possess. In the cold accounting that followed the war, the scale of the Luftwaffe's destruction emerged with a clarity that no propaganda could mask. In the final 2 years alone, tens of thousands of German aircraft were lost, along with many thousands of pilots. Entire cohorts of highly trained aviators vanished from the rosters. The Luftwaffe had not simply been beaten, it had been consumed. The statistics read less like the record of a defeated air force and more like the obituary of an entire institution. German cities and industry shared that fate. Strategic bombing, made truly sustainable by the Mustangs' long reach, battered the Reich's industrial heartland until it resembled a shattered mosaic. Civilian casualties mounted into the hundreds of thousands. Between roughly 1/3 and nearly 1/2 of German industrial capacity was effectively destroyed. Rail yards, bridges, factories, and docks crumbled under repeated blows. What had once been the engine room of continental war-making became a landscape of ruins threaded by improvised repair crews and desperate work gangs. There was no longer such a thing as a rear area. The idea that there could be a safe Germany, a heartland sheltered from the front lines, died the moment Mustangs appeared above Berlin and then over every other major city. With long-range escorts guarding precision bombers, the Allies could hit any factory, any marshalling yard, any oil refinery. There were no rest zones, no quiet sectors where units could regroup without fear of destruction from the air. The entire country had been turned into a battlefield. Hermann Goering, who had once boasted that no enemy aircraft would ever bomb Germany, was forced to face this reality. At Nuremberg, he gave the most brutally concise summary of the Luftwaffe's defeat. When he saw American fighters over Berlin, he said the game was finished. Everything afterward was merely the slow, bloody unwinding of a conclusion already written in the contrails over the capital. That conclusion had been prepared with astonishing speed. The Mustang's development timeline reads today like an engineering legend. From the first North American prototype, the NA-73X, to fully fledged fighters escorting bombers to Berlin took less than 4 years. In that span, the aircraft evolved from an Allison-powered low-altitude model into a high-performing Merlin-powered escort that could fight at the altitudes where the war in Europe was actually being decided. Each variant marked another step in a relentless climb. The early Allison-engined Mustangs were fast and agile at low level, but lacked high-altitude power. The B and C models, equipped with the Packard-built Merlin engine, transformed the aircraft into a high-altitude predator. The later D model added the bubble canopy, 6 heavy-caliber machine guns, improved avionics, and refined drop tanks. The lightweight H model, arriving too late for European combat, pointed toward even greater performance, but by then the Luftwaffe was already in ruins. This rapid evolution reflected a uniquely American approach to wartime development. Feedback from pilots in combat fed directly into design changes. Engineers, factory managers, tacticians, and frontline squadrons participated in a continuous conversation. If a gun sight fogged, it was redesigned. If fuel balance affected stability, plumbing was altered. If pilots needed better visibility, the canopy was revolutionized. In contrast, German advanced fighters such as the Ta-152 and the Me-262 never enjoyed a comparable feedback cycle. They were brilliant on paper and dangerous in the hands of experts, but they arrived late in small numbers and under such chaotic conditions that their full potential was never realized. The Mustang did more than win dogfights. It transformed theory into practice. Before the war, advocates of strategic bombing had argued that destroying an enemy's industry and infrastructure could break its capacity to wage war. Yet without long-range escort fighters, daylight precision bombing had proved too costly. Schweinfurt and other early raids showed that bombers alone could not force their way through determined defenses. The P-51 changed that. For the first time, formations of heavy bombers could push deep into enemy territory, deliver carefully aimed payloads, and return with losses that, while tragic, were sustainable. Daylight precision began to outshine the night area bombing favored by the Royal Air Force. Where night raids often scattered bombs across wide swaths of city and countryside, American daylight attacks could place bombs within roughly 1,000 feet of their intended aim points. The difference was the difference between bludgeoning and surgery. General Curtis LeMay later acknowledged that without the Mustang, strategic bombing would have remained a blunt instrument. With it, the United States could methodically dismantle specific pillars of the German war machine. The list of those pillars is instructive. Ball-bearing factories saw their output cut, drastically choking the supply of critical components to tank and aircraft plants. Synthetic fuel production fell by almost total percentages in some months. Synthetic rubber was crippled. Railroad traffic and canal transport were slashed by repeated attacks on bridges, marshalling yards, and waterways. Each of these sectors had once been mapped as a theoretical vulnerability. The Mustang turned those theories into operational reality. As the war progressed, the image of the Mustang itself became iconic. Photographs of sleek bubble canopy fighters shepherding vast bomber streams across the European sky circulated through newspapers, magazines, and newsreels. Wartime posters used the Mustang as proof that American industry and ingenuity could reach across an ocean challenge a once invincible enemy in its own home, and prevail. After the war, the Mustang appeared in films, memoirs, and air shows as a symbol of a particular kind of power, confident, mobile, and technologically sophisticated. For Germans, the same image carried an entirely different meaning. In literature and cinema, the sight of Allied fighters roaming unopposed over German cities stood for the regime's failure to defend its people. The Mustang became shorthand for helplessness, for the moment when the promise of protection evaporated and the sky belonged to someone else. Many Luftwaffe veterans carried a quiet, enduring shame. Heinz Noack wrote that a fighter pilot's sacred duty is to guard the air above his homeland, and that the sight of Mustangs over Berlin was visible, irrefutable proof that he and his comrades had failed in that duty. The lessons of this transformation did not remain confined to history books. Militaries around the world studied the Mustang's impact as a template for modern air power. They learned that range is not a mere technical specification, but a strategic force multiplier. The ability to project power deeply into enemy territory gives commanders choices that opponents cannot easily anticipate or counter. They learned that integrating aircraft into a larger system, intelligence, logistics, training, manufacturing, and command, matters more than producing a few extraordinary machines. They noted that production scale can be as decisive as design excellence. A nation that can field many very good fighters will often defeat a nation fielding a handful of superb ones. They saw that pilot training quality multiplies the value of every aircraft placed on the line. Without well-prepared aircrew, the most advanced fighter becomes little more than scrap metal waiting for a mishap. And they absorbed the sobering truth that adaptation speed often determines survival. The United States adjusted tactics, training curricula, and hardware on a rolling basis. German innovation, though brilliant, was crushed beneath political interference and doctrinal rigidity. In strategic terms, the Mustang's arrival over Berlin marked the collapse of the Nazi worldview. The idea of fortress Germany, protected by distance and ringed with unassailable defenses, dissolved. The belief that the United States was too clumsy, too disorganized, or too soft to wage sustained war across an ocean proved disastrously wrong. The regime had gambled on distance and intimidation. The Mustang proved that neither could withstand the organized power of an industrial democracy. Yet the Mustang's triumph was not bloodless. More than 2,000 P-51s were lost in combat in the European theatre. Behind each loss was a pilot whose story ended in fire or cold water or a prisoner of war camp. Men like Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Brooks, who died when his Mustang was struck by anti-aircraft fire, left families who would live with the absence long after victory parades ended. Others survived the war only to die in peacetime flying accidents or to carry invisible wounds in the form of nightmares, guilt, and the heavy memory of enemies shot down in helpless spirals. Still, their cumulative efforts achieved something strategically decisive. From March of 1944 onward, the Luftwaffe was no longer a coherent fighting force. It became a collection of isolated units capable of moments of bravery but unable to halt the tide. On Victory in Europe Day, Mustangs patrolled the skies over a defeated Germany, and there was no one left to challenge them. The air force that had once strode confidently across Europe had been reduced to scattered wreckage and grounded relics. The speed of this collapse remains startling. In barely 14 months from the first sighting of Mustangs over Berlin to the end of organized German resistance, an entire air power system was broken. During that period, Mustang pilots flew hundreds of thousands of sorties, claimed thousands of aerial victories, destroyed thousands more aircraft on the ground, and delivered tens of thousands of tons of bombs, firing ammunition in quantities that defy easy imagination. Yet the essential secret of their success was never just individual courage. It was the alignment of those individuals with a vast, disciplined, logistical, and industrial network. Hubert Zemke, one of the leading American fighter commanders, summed it up with disarming simplicity. The Allies, he said, had more of everything: more planes, more fuel, more pilots, more training. The Mustang allowed them to apply that more wherever they chose. Once a P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin and back, the mathematics of victory became almost inevitable. Seen in this light, Major Hans Kogler's first horrified glimpse of Mustangs above Brandenburg becomes something more than a dramatic opening scene. It becomes a symbol of the future of warfare. In that moment, he was not merely seeing a new fighter. He was seeing the embodiment of a system that could ignore geography, overcome distance, and impose its will with methodical, overwhelming force. Luftwaffe pilots who looked up at those silver shapes were not just facing better machines. They were confronting the industrial, technological, and organizational strength of the United States compressed into aluminum and steel. The Mustang over Berlin marked the point where modern war shifted decisively from the realm of individual prowess to the realm of systems and structures. Industrial capacity, logistical reach, and strategic air power now mattered more than any one ace's skill. In the decades that followed, the echoes of that shift were heard in every major conflict. The ability of the United States to project precise, overwhelming force across continents became a defining feature of the post-war order. The myth that authoritarian regimes possessed some inherent superiority in discipline or efficiency was quietly dismantled. The Mustang had helped prove that democracies, despite their arguments and imperfections, could mobilize more effectively, innovate faster, and sustain complex operations longer. For the Luftwaffe pilots who survived, the memory of those days held a particular poignancy. They had watched their own obsolescence unfold in the sky and had lived long enough to see their state and its ideology crumble as well. Within 14 months of the first Mustangs arriving over Berlin, the regime that sent them into battle was gone. Yet the story did not end with defeat. The shock that began above Brandenburg ultimately led to a very different Europe. Former enemies rebuilt their air forces under democratic governments. Johannes Steinhoff and other veterans helped construct a new German air force that would cooperate rather than clash with its former foes. Those same skies that had once echoed with gunfire now hosted joint exercises and alliance patrols. For veterans on all sides, the sound of a Merlin engine remained unforgettable. For American airmen, it was the sound of hard-won victory. For German survivors, it was the sound that announced the beginning of the end. For historians, it became the audible signature of a turning point in the history of warfare, the moment when illusions yielded to reality. Mustangs over Berlin became more than a scene in a wartime narrative. They symbolized the collision between propaganda and physical fact, between ideology and logistics, between promised invincibility and the unrelenting pressure of organized democratic power. From that collision came not only the end of a criminal regime, but the opportunity to build a different kind of peace. In 1984, when Adolf Galland raised a glass with the men who had once flown against him, he acknowledged both the shock and the outcome. The Mustangs, he said, had not only ended the war, they had also, in their way, helped begin the peace that followed. The shock experienced by Hans Kogler and his comrades on that clear March morning had rippled outward through defeat, occupation, reconstruction, and alliance. The aircraft that once symbolized terror for Germany had, in the long arc of history, helped create the conditions for 8 decades of relative peace in Europe. That is the final legacy of the P-51 Mustang. Not only that it won a war, but that the shock it delivered over Berlin helped clear the sky for a different future.